Go to sleep. My VIP guests are arriving, and I don't need you cluttering up the living room." Richard barked the words, shoving me by the shoulder into the dark hallway. I was still clutching a damp dish towel in my hands. "My name is Helen. I'm 68 years old, and for a decade I've been baking the bread that other people devour." What Richard didn't know, what he was too blind to see, was that the key to the pantry and the very weight of this house had always lived right here in my pocket. The whole thing had started hours earlier at 4 in the morning, when the December frost was still biting through the cracks in the kitchen windows. At that hour, the house was buried in absolute silence. It was the only sliver of the day when I felt like this place actually belonged to me again. I rolled out of bed, greeting the familiar, dull ache in my knees. It's a phantom sting that's shadowed me for years, but you learn to ignore it. Work doesn't wait for the creaking bones of the old. I slid my feet into worn-out slippers, tied the thick wool robe my late husband Arthur gave me our last Christmas together, and walked slowly into my territory. The kitchen was freezing, but it wouldn't be for long. I flipped the switch. The fluorescent light buzzed and flickered twice before washing the white subway tiles in a pale glow. There, resting on the center island, massive and pale, was the 22-pound turkey I'd been thawing since Tuesday. Right next to it, wrapped in tight plastic, a gargantuan bone-in ham waited its turn. 20 people. That was the number Richard had casually dropped last week with the same effortless entitlement of a man asking for a glass of water. 20 people from his firm. The new partners, the investors who were going to change his life, or so he claimed. I washed my hands with freezing water and a block of harsh soap, feeling the knuckles stiffen and go numb. I grabbed my blue apron, the one with edges frayed from 100 washes, and tied it around my waist. That knot was my armor. I started on the marinade, peeling whole heads of garlic, cracking black peppercorns, squeezing bitter oranges until the acid bit viciously into a paper cut on my index finger. I threw it all into the blender with a heavy splash of cheap white wine, apple cider vinegar, cumin, oregano. I'd dried in the sun myself, and a fistful of coarse sea salt. The roar of the blender's motor shattered the early morning quiet, but I knew no one upstairs was going to wake up. They are heavy sleepers. It's the deep, untroubled sleep of people who know someone else is awake, holding up the sky for them. I rubbed the turkey down with the wet spice blend, shoving my hands deep under the freezing skin, massaging the meat so the flavor would seep right down to the bone. It's a brutal physical job. My wrists screamed with every twist, but I kept going. I thought about Arthur. He used to get up with me at this hour. He'd sit in the corner chair with a mug of black coffee, just keeping me company. He didn't cook, but he'd hand me the knives. He'd whisper terrible dad jokes so he wouldn't wake our daughter Valerie. And when that massive bird was ready for the oven, Arthur was the one who lifted it with his heavy, calloused hands. But Arthur has been 6 feet under for 5 years now. I had to learn to lift the dead weight alone. Literally. With a strain that pulled a low groan from my chest, I hoisted the heavy aluminum roaster and slid it into the preheated oven. By 6 in the morning, the heavy, intoxicating smell of roasting meat and spices was already creeping through the floorboards. I sat down for the first time just 5 stolen minutes to drink a cup of cinnamon tea and wrap my freezing fingers around the warm ceramic. I stared out the window as the sky began to bleed into a pale, freezing blue. There was no time to rest. The ham needed its own glaze, brown sugar, smoked paprika cloves, and pineapple juice. The cycle started all over again, chop, blend, massage, bake. At 8 o'clock, my grandkids, 7-year-old Leo and little 4-year-old Mia, came tumbling down the stairs. They ran into the kitchen in their flannel pajamas, pulled in like magnets by the heat and the smells. "Smells so good, Grandma," Leo yelled, wrapping his arms around my legs. The exhaustion evaporated for exactly 1 second. That right there is my weakness, my eternal vulnerability. Everything I do, every burn on my forearms, every stabbing pain in my spine, I do it for them. I whipped up a quick breakfast: scrambled eggs, crispy hash browns, and warm tortillas. I sat them at the small breakfast nook and watched them eat. I had knitted them matching red sweaters to wear tonight. I'd spent all of November knitting in the dark, hiding my work, just to surprise them. At 9, Valerie appeared. My daughter shuffled in, dragging her feet wrapped in a silk robe Richard had bought her on one of his corporate trips. Her hair was a mess, a green clay mask smeared across her face. "Mom, how's it coming?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee without even looking me in the eye. "Richard is losing his mind with stress. The turkey's almost done, sweetheart. The ham goes in soon. Just need to finish the desserts. The mashed potatoes, the cranberry apple salad, and the baked ziti." I answered, wiping my hands on my apron. "Oh, good. Look, today is make or break for him. The owners of the development firm are coming. Everything has to be flawless, Mum. Flawless. No chipped plates, okay? The deed to this house is in my name. Arthur and I built this place brick by brick. But when he passed away, Richard decided it would be best if they moved in to take care of me." Slowly, the furniture vanished. They painted over my warm walls with cold, sterile greys that I absolutely hated. Eventually, I was pushed into the tiny back bedroom, the one squeezed right next to the laundry room. I took it in silence. I accepted it, because I come from a generation of women who were taught that keeping the peace in the family is worth a hell of a lot more than your own pride. I honestly believed that by yielding, by serving, I was keeping the love intact. By 11 in the morning, I started on the desserts. The heat in the kitchen was suffocating, a brutal, heavy contrast to the freezing wind howling outside. I prepped the dough for the apple pie, cutting cold butter into the flour until my knuckles throbbed. I peeled 6 pounds of apples, slicing them paper thin, tossing them with cinnamon brown sugar and a heavy dash of nutmeg. Then I started melting the sugar for 2 large caramel custard pies. The boiling liquid bubbled violently, and a searing drop of liquid caramel vaulted from the pot, landing dead center on my right forearm. I clamped my teeth together and hissed. I practically dove for the sink, running ice-cold water over the burn. A vicious, throbbing red blister bubbled up instantly, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. If the custard didn't bake now, it wouldn't set in the fridge in time for dinner. At 1 in the afternoon, Richard made his grand entrance into the kitchen. He strutted in, wearing expensive designer athleisure, barking into his cell phone, his chest puffed out like a rooster. He hung up and looked me up and down. I was drenched in sweat. A stray lock of white hair plastered to my forehead, furiously stirring a massive pot of pasta. "Helen," he said, skipping any title of respect. "I really hope you have the exhaust fan on. I don't want the house smelling like a cheap diner when the partners get here. The fan is on, Richard, but I'm cooking for 20 people. It's normal that it smells like food," I said quietly, never stopping the wooden spoon. "Well, open the windows, and please hide those hideous old speckled enamel pots. I don't want my investors seeing that kind of poverty. Use the heavy glass casserole dishes we bought last month." A knot formed in my stomach. A toxic, ancient cocktail of sorrow and rage, but I swallowed it down. I walked over, cranked the window open, and the freezing wind slapped against my sweat-soaked back, making me shiver violently. I transferred the food into his glass dishes. They were heavy, slippery, and soulless. Just the way he wanted them. By 3 o'clock, it was time to set the table. The long, dark oak dining table that Arthur had bought with his very first big Christmas bonus. I went to the hutch and pulled out the white linen tablecloth, the one with the hand-stitched embroidery that used to belong to my mother. We only brought it out for truly sacred occasions. I draped it over the wood and ran a warm iron directly over the fabric smoothing out every microscopic wrinkle. I was bent over that table so long my kidneys screamed in protest. Then came the good china, the real silver flatware that I had to polish piece by piece with baking soda and lemon, because it had gone dull from years of neglect. I laid out 20 plates, 20 crystal wine glasses, 20 cloth napkins folded into sharp fans. It took me nearly 2 hours to make that dining room look like the private room of a Michelin star restaurant. By 5 o'clock, the exhaustion wasn't just physical anymore. It was a thick, suffocating fog blinding my eyes. The turkey was golden, crispy, absolute perfection. The ham was oozing a dark, rich glaze. The mashed potatoes were whipped to a cloud, loaded with exactly the right amount of heavy cream and butter. The pasta, the salads, the dressings. Everything was done. I had built this feast with my own 2 bare hands, with the ticking of my own clock, with the grinding down of my own bones. All that was left was to warm the dinner rolls and serve. I dragged myself to my room, that cramped little box next to the washer and dryer. I sat on the edge of the twin bed and took a ragged breath. Every single muscle fiber in my body was radiating pain. The burn on my arm was throbbing perfectly in sync with my heartbeat. I looked at my dress hanging on the closet door, a simple, elegant burgundy dress that I had washed and ironed with religious care. My black, low-heeled shoes were sitting right underneath it. I just needed 10 minutes. 10 minutes to stand under a hot shower scrub, the smell of garlic and onions off my skin. Put on my dress pin, back my white hair, and walk out to celebrate Christmas Eve with my family. It was 6:30 when the screaming started upstairs. "Leo, take that hideous itchy wool sweater off right now. Are you going to put on the button-down shirt I bought you or not?" It was Richard's voice echoing down the stairs. "But Grandma made it for me," the boy wailed. "I don't give a damn." "Put the shirt on, Valerie. Control your kids for God's sake. The partners are going to be here any minute." I hadn't even showered yet, but I knew if I didn't step in it was going to escalate, and Valerie would end up in tears. I stepped out into the hallway, still wearing my stained apron. I walked toward the kitchen for one final check on the oven. Right at that exact second, the front doorbell rang out. It was 7 o'clock on the dot. They were early. Panic detonated inside the house. I heard Richard's frantic footsteps hammering down the stairs, frantically buttoning the cuffs of an immaculate tailored suit. He reeked of some aggressive, expensive cologne that instantly flooded the hallway, completely wiping out the smell of my cinnamon and sugar. Valerie rushed down right behind him in a tight black dress, stilettos, and flawless makeup, dragging the kids by their wrists. Leo was wearing the stiff, suffocating shirt his father forced on him, his eyes red and puffy from crying. I was standing in the corridor that connected the kitchen to the foyer, just adjacent to the living room. I had a damp dish towel in my hand, wiping a bead of sweat from my brow. I took a step forward. My intention was simple. Open the door, wish the guests a Merry Christmas with a warm smile, and then slip quietly into the back to change. It was my house. It was my food. It was my blood and sweat. I just wanted to say welcome. Richard stopped dead in his tracks the second he saw me. His eyes raked over me from head to toe, and he didn't even try to hide the pure, unfiltered disgust on his face. He saw my messy hair, my shiny, sweating forehead, my apron stained with meat juices, the blistering burn on my arm, my old slippers. He saw everything I had sacrificed to give him his flawless night. And the only thing he felt was shame. The doorbell chimed again, longer and more insistent this time. Lively voices and laughter leaked through the heavy oak door. I took another step toward the entryway. "I'll get it, Richard, don't worry." He shoved me. He planted his hand on my shoulder and shoved me backward, forcing me to retreat into the shadows of the hallway leading to the kitchen. The push was violent enough to make me stumble, losing my balance on my aching knees. I had to grab the doorframe just to keep from hitting the floor. "Go to sleep," My VIP guests are arriving, and I don't need you cluttering up the living room, he hissed. His voice was a venomous whisper, teeth clenched tight, so the people outside wouldn't hear him. I froze. The oxygen just stopped in my throat. I looked into his eyes, searching for a flicker of remorse, a second of hesitation. There was nothing, just a frantic urge to hide me. Just pure, unadulterated contempt. I turned my head slowly to look at Valerie. My daughter. The little girl whose scraped knees I used to bandage. The girl whose college tuition I paid by selling cakes out of this very kitchen. The woman for whom I had accepted living like a ghost in a laundry room. Valerie was standing 6 feet away. She saw the shove. She heard the words. And instead of defending her mother, instead of telling her husband to take his hands off me, Valerie dropped her gaze to the marble floor. She pretended to adjust the collar on little Leo's shirt. She played deaf. She played blind. Her silence was a second shove infinitely more violent than Richard's. The doorbell rang for the 3rd time. "Go to your room, Helen. You did your part, now disappear," Richard ordered. He let go of my shoulder, instantly turning his back to me. In a fraction of a second, his enraged face morphed into a massive, blindingly fake smile as he glided toward the front door. "Mr. Sterling, so wonderful to see you. Come in. Come in. Welcome to our humble home." I heard Richard purr, throwing the door wide open. "Right this way, please. My wife and I have prepared a spectacular dinner for you." I felt something inside me, something soft and warm, that I had kept alive for years out of sheer stubborn love for my family, just dry up and die. It was a physical sensation, like a bucket of ice water dumped straight over the glowing embers of my heart. All the exhaustion, all the radiating pain in my spine, the burning sting on my arm, it all vanished, replaced by a cold, absolute, terrifying clarity. They had looked at me as the help for so long, they forgot who actually owned the damn house. They forgot that turkeys don't roast themselves, tables don't set themselves. The magic of this family didn't spring from Richard's paycheck. It was forged by my broken hands. They wanted me invisible. They wanted me in the dark, turning the gears of their perfect little lives, making sure I didn't ruin the aesthetic of their photograph. I looked down at my stained apron. I looked back toward the kitchen where the ovens were still radiating heat and the food was steaming in its pristine glass dishes. Then I looked toward my room at the end of the hall. Slowly, without making a single sound, I reached behind my back. I untied the knot of the blue apron. I let the fabric slide off my shoulders and pool on the floor with a soft hiss. I dropped the damp dish towel right on top of it. I didn't say a word. I didn't glance back toward the brightly lit living room where Valerie was taking the coats of strangers. I walked down the dark hallway, dragging my feet just a little, but my spine was straighter than it had been in a decade. I stepped into my cramped room. I didn't turn on the light. I grabbed the cold metal doorknob and pulled it shut. The click of the deadbolt sliding into place was sharp, final. It severed the fake laughter echoing from the living room like a guillotine. I sat on the edge of my bed in the pitch black, listening as they began to circle the banquet I had built. They had absolutely no idea of the void they had just created. They didn't know that when this door clicked shut, the engine keeping their entire universe alive had just been permanently powered down. The silence rang in my ears, but it didn't last. Seconds after the lock engaged, the noise from the party started bleeding through the paper-thin walls of my bedroom. I could hear the high-pitched clinking of expensive crystal during the toasts, the low, rumbling voices of men talking corporate strategy, the rehearsed, airy laughter of the wives, and I heard Richard's voice, booming, confident, dominating the very space that Arthur and I had built with years of sacrifice and early mornings. "To new beginnings, Mr. Sterling." My son-in-law's voice boomed, carrying down the hall right to my bed. "And to the partnerships that will take us to the next level. Mi casa es su casa. Please make yourselves at home. He said it, with a mouth full of pride, giving away a kingdom that didn't belong to him, standing on floors I had polished on my hands and knees. I sat there feeling the sharp, rhythmic stabbing of the blister on my right forearm where the boiling caramel had caught me. I raised my hand in the dark and pressed the pad of my finger directly against the wound. The pain was sharp, clean, and incredibly real. It anchored me. For the last 5 years, ever since I closed Arthur's eyes for the last time in that hospital room, I had been living in a self-imposed coma. I had tiptoed through the hallways of my own home, asking for permission to exist, shrinking myself down so I wouldn't be a nuisance. I swallowed the disrespect, nursing the pathetic delusion that my submission would buy my daughter's love and guarantee my grandchildren's peace. But Richard's shove, that heavy, arrogant hand on my shoulder swatting me away like a stray dog at the screen door that shattered the spell. And Valerie's silence, her eyes glued to the marble floor, while her husband humiliated me, that swept up the remaining pieces and threw them in the trash. I stood up. My knees popped with their usual hollow crunch, but this time I didn't care. I flicked on the cheap little bedside lamp resting on the particle board nightstand. The yellow light washed over my sanctuary, a twin bed, a flimsy wardrobe Richard had bought at a big box store to replace my antique vanity, and a shoebox shoved in the corner. I walked over to the wardrobe and pulled open the doors. They squeaked against the humidity. There, hanging on a wire hanger, was my burgundy dress. I ran my fingertips over the fabric. It was a simple cut, 3/4 sleeves, a modest neckline, but it had a weight to it that made me feel bulletproof. I had bought it with my own savings, planning to debut it tonight. Planning to sit at the head of the table, surrounded by my blood, I took it off the hanger. I kicked off the worn-out slippers. I untied the wool robe that smelled like wood smoke, fried onions, and lonely mornings, letting it drop onto the unmade bed. I dressed with slow, methodical precision. I pulled the zipper up my back, feeling the fabric embrace my exhausted frame. I sat back down to buckle my black, low-heeled shoes, securing the straps over my swollen insteps. I walked over to the cheap mirror, hanging on the back of the door. I brushed my white hair, pinning it back neatly with a couple of dark bobby pins. I didn't put on makeup. I've never liked the stuff, but I pinched my cheeks hard to force some color back into them. I didn't look sad. I looked utterly exhausted, yes. Deep, bruised shadows hung under my eyes, but there was a new, terrifying hardness in my jawline. I was no longer the frightened widow surrendering her territory. I knelt by the bed and dragged out the shoebox. Inside was my actual life, the life they completely ignored. I pulled out a small, tough black leather crossbody bag Arthur had given me for an anniversary. Inside the bag, I dropped my ID, the debit card. Where my modest widow's pension landed every month, the original brass keys to the house, and a manila envelope folded dead in half. Inside that envelope was the deed to the property, in my name, free and clear of any mortgage or lien. Richard had never demanded it outright, but he had spent months dropping heavy hints that we needed to regularize the paperwork and put the house in Valerie's name. I never handed it over. That envelope was my invisible shield. I dropped Arthur's old wristwatch and a silver rosary into the bag, zipped it shut, and slung it across my chest. The plan didn't form in my head with words. It came in sharp, undeniable impulses. If they wanted me invisible, I would be a ghost. If my presence was a stain on their perfect evening, I would remove it entirely. But I wasn't leaving empty-handed. I walked to my door and pressed my ear against the wood. The party was in full swing. The smooth jazz Richard always played to make himself look sophisticated was humming at a tasteful volume. The voices were all clustered in the living room and the foyer. The dining room and kitchen, located in the opposite wing, had to be completely dead. I gripped the cold doorknob, twisted it agonizingly slowly so the latch wouldn't click, and opened the door just a crack. The hallway was pitch black. The bright, warm light spilled out from the archway connecting to the main living room. I stepped out walking on the balls of my feet so my heels wouldn't click against the hardwood. I glided past the living room archway without stopping, but out of the corner of my eye, I caught the tableau. Richard was standing by the unlit fireplace, swirling a whiskey on the rocks, flashing all his teeth as he charmed a silver-haired man in a bespoke suit. Valerie was perched on the white leather sofa legs, crossed, nodding vigorously at something the partner's wife was saying, laughing with that high, hollow pitch she reserved strictly for people with money. The kids were nowhere to be seen, probably banished upstairs to play so they wouldn't ruin the aesthetic. It was all so pristine. A perfect glossy magazine lie. I reached the swinging door to the kitchen and pushed it gently with my shoulder. The temperature shift hit me instantly. The air in here was still thick with the residual heat of the ovens and the heavy, intoxicating aroma of roasting meat spices and cinnamon. I flicked on just the tiny light under the exhaust hood, leaving the rest of the kitchen cloaked in shadows so the light wouldn't bleed under the door into the hall. I stepped up to the massive granite island. Sitting there were the heavy, pretentious glass casserole dishes Richard had forced me to use. In one rested the bone-in ham, shimmering in its dark, sticky glaze. In the other, colossal and golden, was the 22-pound turkey I had massaged, basted and roasted since 4 a.m. Off to the side, wrapped tight in foil, were the 2 caramel custard pies, the whipped potatoes, and the cranberry apple salad. I stared at the food. My food. Richard had bought the ingredients for the ham and the sides. That was true. But the turkey, that behemoth, that was the undisputed star of the show, I had paid for that out of my own pocket. "I don't have cash on me, Helen. You cover it and I'll pay you back tomorrow," he had said at the butcher shop last week. Tomorrow never came. It never did with him. The ingredients for the desserts had also come from my worn coin purse, bought penny by penny at the corner bodega, because Valerie forgot to put them on her grocery delivery app. I opened the bottom drawer of the pantry. I didn't hesitate. I pulled out 3 heavy-duty canvas tote bags, the ones I used to haul root vegetables from the farmer's market. I walked straight to the turkey. I grabbed a massive metal spoon and a carving fork. I wasn't about to take the expensive glass dish that belonged to my son-in-law. I reached down and grabbed my old, battered, blue speckled enamel roaster, the one he called Poverty. With a swift, expert motion, I drove the fork deep into the turkey's breast and used the spoon to cradle it from underneath. It weighed a ton. My wrists shook violently under the strain, but the adrenaline and pure rage gave me a strength I thought I'd lost decades ago. I hoisted the perfect golden bird out of the crystal and dropped it into my ugly old pot. The sound of the hot meat settling into the aluminum sent a shockwave of pure satisfaction straight down my spine. I tipped the glass dish and poured every last drop of the rich pan drippings over the bird, leaving his crystal entirely empty, smeared with a pathetic film of grease. I covered the roaster with a double layer of heavy-duty foil, crimped the edges tight, and lowered it into the first canvas bag. I moved to the desserts. The 2 metal tins of caramel custard went straight into the second bag. I grabbed a Tupperware container from the cupboard and scraped every last ounce of the cranberry apple salad into it, making sure I didn't leave a single walnut behind in his crystal bowl. I left the glazed ham, the mashed potatoes, and the baked ziti untouched. After all, Richard paid for those. Let them eat the sides. Let them celebrate their $1 million deals, chewing on cold pasta and pork. I was just tightening the knot on the handles of the canvas bags when a sharp squeak froze the blood in my veins. Someone had pushed the swinging kitchen door. I turned slowly, kicking the bags behind the center island, resting my hands flat on the cold granite. It was Richard. He stormed into the kitchen, his face flushed from the scotch and the thrill of his own ego carrying an empty silver ice bucket. He didn't bother turning on the main light. He just marched straight for the refrigerator. When he saw me standing there in the shadows, he stopped dead. His eyes tracked over my burgundy dress, my polished shoes, my styled hair. His expression snapped from shock to outright fury in a microsecond. "Helen, what the hell are you doing dressed like that?" he spat, dropping his voice into a vicious hiss as he stomped toward me. "Didn't I tell you explicitly to go to sleep? I don't want you wandering around the house like a ghost while we're eating." My pulse was hammering in my throat, but the muscles in my face didn't twitch. I didn't back up a single inch. "I came for a glass of water," I replied. My voice was so flat, so dead and metallic, I barely recognized it myself. Richard let out a disgusted scoff and slammed the silver ice bucket down on the granite counter barely 2 feet away from the empty, grease-stained glass dishes he was too blind to notice in the dark. "Well, drink your water and get the hell back to your room," he ordered, pointing a stiff finger at the door. "Mr. Sterling is in love with the house. In 10 minutes, I'm moving everyone into the dining room. Listen to me very closely, Helen. In 10 minutes, I'm coming in here to get the turkey and the food. Fill this bucket to the brim with ice, leave it on the counter, and turn the oven on to warm up the dinner rolls. Do not step foot in that hallway for any reason. Understand, I'll carry the plates out myself. I am not having my investors see my mother-in-law playing the maid." I stared at him. This man who slept under a roof my husband built. This man who ate from my pots, barking orders at me like I was a trespasser in my own sanctuary. "Of course, Richard," I said, dragging the words out with agonizing slowness. "I'll take care of the ice." He spun on his heel, pushed through the swinging door, and vanished back into the noise and the bright lights of his counterfeit world. I was completely alone. The clock on the kitchen wall read 8:20 p.m. I had exactly 10 minutes before the sky fell on his head. I didn't touch the ice bucket. I didn't touch the oven knob. I didn't take the dinner rolls out of their plastic bag. I grabbed the handles of the 3 heavy canvas bags. The weight of the turkey in the first bag was brutal. It forced my spine to tilt, pulling the muscles in my neck taut like piano wire. The other 2 bags, loaded with the custards and the salad, hung heavily from my left arm. I walked toward the back door of the kitchen, the one that led to the small service patio, and from there down a narrow alleyway, straight to the main street. It was the door we used to take out the trash, the door for the delivery guys, the door for the invisible people. It was the perfect exit. I slid the rusted iron deadbolt back with my free hand. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The freezing December wind hit my face like a glorious, reviving slap. The contrast to the stifling heat of the kitchen made me let out a long, shuddering exhale. I stepped out onto the concrete patio, my right foot dragging slightly under the immense weight of the bags. I didn't lock the door behind me. I just pulled it shut until I heard the metallic click of the latch. I walked down the side alley in total darkness, letting the memory in my feet guide me. When I hit the sidewalk, the sickly yellow glow of the street lamps washed over me. The neighborhood was a ghost town. At this hour on Christmas Eve, every family was locked inside, feasting, drinking, laughing. The silence on the street was absolute, broken only by the crunch of dead leaves under my shoes and the ragged rhythm of my own breathing. I didn't have a destination in mind when I walked out of my room. But as I trudged down the cracked pavement of my subdivision, my feet autonomously carried me toward the only place I knew the doors would be unlocked. St. Jude's Parish was only 5 blocks from my house. It was where Arthur and I had gotten married, where we had baptized Valerie, and where I spent my Thursday afternoons volunteering at the community pantry. The walk was pure, agonizing torture. By the second block, the canvas straps were biting so deeply into my palms, they cut off the circulation, leaving my fingers entirely numb. I had to stop under a streetlight, rest the turkey bag on a low brick wall, and massage the life back into my hands. The cold was sinking into my bones, right through the thin fabric of the burgundy dress. But my soul wasn't cold. Quite the opposite. With every step that put distance between me and that house, I felt a heavy, suffocating crust cracking and falling off my chest. I was breathing clean oxygen for the first time in a decade. I checked my watch. 8:28 p.m. Right at this exact second, Richard had to be pushing through the swinging kitchen door, rubbing his hands together, ready to carry his elegant glass dishes into the dining room. I could see the scene with high-definition clarity. I could see his arrogant, blinding smile freezing on his face the second he hit the lights. I could see his eyes locking onto the empty glass dishes smeared with grease and scraps. I could hear the lethal, suffocating silence in that kitchen as the reality hit him: no turkey, no desserts, no salad, and worst of all, no mother-in-law to scream at. A tiny, dry, razor-sharp smile carved itself into the corner of my mouth. I picked up the bags and kept walking. Up ahead, I saw the stone facade of the parish. The heavy wooden double doors were thrown wide open, spilling a warm, golden glow out onto the plaza. We were hours away from the traditional midnight mass, but I knew the adjacent parish hall was always buzzing. The women of the community always threw together a modest dinner for the neighborhood folks who didn't have anywhere else to go. The lonely elderly, the strays, the guys who slept on the park benches. I climbed the 3 stone steps to the courtyard, my legs trembling violently from the strain. The sheer weight of the food had pulled a cold sweat from my forehead, ruining my neatly pinned hair, but I couldn't have cared less. I pushed through the side doors into the hall. The smell of hot fruit punch and melting wax hit me instantly. The noise washed over me. There were a couple of long folding tables covered in cheap, shiny paper tablecloths. About 15 older folks were sitting around sipping from styrofoam cups, talking in low murmurs. At the far end, near a makeshift kitchenette, was Martha Santini. Martha was a widow around my age, armed with limitless energy and a booming voice that commanded the church choir. She was wearing a white apron over a thick wool sweater, stirring a massive pot of cider with a wooden paddle. When she looked up and saw me stagger in, practically dragging the canvas bags across the linoleum floor, she dropped the paddle and sprinted toward me. "Holy Mother of God! Helen, what are you doing here at this hour? And what on earth are you carrying that's breaking your back?" Martha gasped. She immediately grabbed the bag holding the turkey, taking the brutal weight off my shoulder. The relief in my arm was so sudden and intense, I nearly lost my balance. I leaned against the doorframe, sucking in a huge breath of air, feeling the blood rush back into my deadened fingers like pins and needles. "I brought dinner, Martha," I said. My voice was raspy from the freezing wind and the exhaustion. Martha frowned, deeply confused. She hauled the heavy canvas bag over to one of the empty folding tables and started untying the knot. When she opened it and saw the massive battered blue enamel roaster, and then peeled back the foil just enough to let a cloud of golden steam and the scent of roasted garlic and wine flood the room, her eyes went wide as saucers. "Helen, this is a feast," she whispered, looking up at me. "What about your family, your daughter? You told me on Sunday you were having a full house, that your son-in-law invited the big bosses from his firm." "My son-in-law said he wanted a luxury dinner, Martha." I replied, my tone dead flat, not a single tremor in my voice. "But he forgot that you can't serve luxury on empty plates. And he forgot who actually owns the kitchen." She didn't need me to draw her a map. She looked at my nice dress, wrinkled from the labor. She looked at the black leather bag strapped across my chest, holding my entire life, and she understood exactly what I had just detonated. A deep, silent smile of pure complicity spread across Martha's face. She gave a single firm nod. She didn't ask another question. "Well, you all are in luck tonight," Martha boomed, her voice projecting across the hall, snapping the attention of every elderly person in the room. "It looks like we've got 20 people here who are going to eat like absolute royalty. Somebody get me the carving knives." I walked over to the table, pulled the carving fork out of the bag, and got ready to serve. All around me, the murmurs in the hall swelled into gasps of genuine shock and gratitude. The warmth of human beings instantly erased the chill of the street. As I sliced into the first cut of breast meat, white, flawless, dripping with juices, I heard the church bells ringing in the distance. 9 o'clock. 5 blocks away, the bomb had gone off. Richard was standing in front of a granite island, with his hands completely empty, staring directly into the abyss of his own staggering arrogance. While his VIP guests sat in the dining room seconds away from realizing their host was nothing but a hollow fraud, propped up by the very woman he had just thrown out like trash. And me, for the first time in a decade, I was going to eat in peace. The knife glided through the turkey with a buttery resistance you only get from hours of slow, agonizingly perfect roasting. The golden skin crackled under the steel, releasing a cloud of steam that smelled like white wine oregano and rendered fat. Right across from me on the other side of the cheap plastic table, Old Man Henderson was holding a styrofoam plate with 2 shaking hands. His eyes, cloudy with cataracts, were locked onto the thick slab of meat I had just carved. I took the large metal spoon, scooped up a pool of the dark, rich drippings from the bottom of my ugly aluminum pot, and poured it right over the meat. I handed him the plate. The old man nodded silently, his eyes shining, and shuffled slowly back to his folding chair. Right behind him, Mrs. Higgins was already waiting, clutching a paper napkin to her chest like it was a winning lottery ticket. For the next 20 minutes, all I did was carve, scoop, and serve. Martha handled the desserts, flipping the caramel custards onto paper plates, cutting them into perfectly calculated wedges so every single person got a slice. The parish hall, which had been a quiet, drafty room just a half-hour ago, was now alive with the clatter of plastic forks scraping against plates. The low hum of happy chatter and the radiating heat of 20 people who hadn't expected a damn thing from tonight. I didn't serve myself right away. I just stood behind the folding table, resting my hands on the hard plastic edge, watching the food that had cost me the skin on my knuckles and the cartilage in my spine disappear into the mouths of people who treated it like a sacrament. Not a single person in this room complained that we weren't drinking out of crystal goblets. Not a single person looked at my blue speckled pot with disgust. When the very last plate was handed out, Martha walked up to me and pressed a styrofoam cup full of steaming hot cider into my hands. She gently guided me by the shoulder toward an empty chair in the corner of the room. I sat down. The rigid plastic flexed a little under my weight. I felt the dull throbbing in my kneecaps and the burning on the soles of my feet, but for the first time all day, I didn't feel the phantom urge to jump up and keep working. I took a sip of the cider. The hot, sweet liquid burned down my throat, untying a knot I didn't even realize had been choking me since 4 a.m. I looked down at the hard plastic chair I was sitting on. That physical discomfort yanked my brain backward, spiraling down to a rainy Tuesday afternoon 3 years ago. The exact day I lost my right to sit down in my own home. I had walked to the farmer's market to buy the week's vegetables. I walked back in a freezing drizzle, lugging 4 heavy plastic bags that were cutting the circulation off in my fingers. When I unlocked the front door, I dropped the bags in the foyer to shake the rain off my coat. That's when I looked into the living room. The space right by the front window, the corner that always caught the late afternoon sun, was empty. There was nothing but a square indentation crushed into the carpet. The only proof that Arthur's olive green recliner had ever existed. The chair where he used to sit and read the Sunday paper. The chair where I would curl up and knit every night since the day we buried him. I walked into the living room, my wet shoes staining the hardwood. Richard was standing against the wall, holding a metal tape measure, punching numbers into his phone. I stopped right in front of him. I asked him where the chair was. My voice sounded tiny, swallowed by the sound of the rain lashing against the glass. Richard didn't even look up from his screen. I had the trash guys haul it away, Helen. That piece of junk smelled like an old folks' home and made the whole house look pathetic. I'm buying a minimalist designer sofa for this corner. The partners from the firm can't come over and see us living in a flea market. It was the chair where Arthur held me when we found out Valerie was pregnant. It was the chair I had hand-upholstered myself to cover a tear in the fabric. I spun around, looking for my daughter. Valerie was in the open-concept kitchen. Her back turned to us, aggressively scrubbing a pot that was already clean. She had the faucet running on full blast, using the roaring water as an acoustic shield so she wouldn't have to hear me. "Valerie," I called out from the living room. She didn't turn around. Her shoulders went rigid under her silk blouse, but she didn't shut the water off. She let the noise drown out my grief. She let Richard erase the last physical memory of her father, erasing my only place of rest, all in the name of a minimalist sofa that I was never allowed to sit on. That afternoon, I picked up my groceries from the floor, walked into the kitchen, passed right behind my daughter without touching her, and locked myself in my room. I never sat in that living room again. A sudden, violent vibration jolted me back to the present. It was coming from inside the black leather bag strapped to my chest. I reached in, pushing past the manila envelope, holding the deed to the house, and pulled out the cell phone. It was a cheap prepaid brick with a cracked screen that Richard had handed me a year ago, claiming it was for emergencies, and so he could text me grocery lists while he was at the office. The screen lit up, casting a harsh blue glare in my dark corner. The digital clock read 9:15 p.m. Right below the time, a name was flashing in massive red letters. Richard. The phone buzzed against my palm like a trapped hornet. I didn't answer. I just stared at the screen, watching the name vanish, instantly replaced by a notification banner. 14 missed calls. 8 from Richard. 6 from Valerie. Barely 3 seconds of silence passed before the plastic brick started vibrating violently again. This time the name flashing on the screen was Valerie. Martha Santini, who was clearing a stack of empty plates from a nearby table, caught the glare of the screen in my hands. She walked over slowly, wiping her hands on her apron, and stopped right next to my chair. She looked down at the phone, then looked at my face. "They're calling," Martha whispered. It wasn't a question, just a grim statement of fact. "Yes," I replied, never taking my eyes off my daughter's name. "Do you want me to turn it off for you, Helen? I can go lock it in Father Thomas's desk drawer. That way you won't even hear it buzzing." "No, I want to watch it ring." I could see him. I could see Richard standing in the kitchen, his silk tie ripped loose, his face purple with a lethal cocktail of panic and rage ripping the oven doors open, staring at the empty grease-smeared glass dishes, realizing there was no turkey, no desserts, no magic. I could picture Valerie locked in the downstairs half-bath, jabbing my number into her phone, with shaking fingers. Absolutely paralyzed by the public humiliation her husband was currently suffering in front of the men who held his future. They were desperately hunting for their invisible maid. But the maid had clocked out. The phone stopped ringing. The screen went black, plunging me back into the shadows. I rested my thumb on the power button to shut the damn thing off for good, but before I could press it, another call pushed through. Valerie. That glowing name tugged on another thread of memory, dragging me back to the exact moment I realized my daughter didn't view me as a mother anymore. She viewed me as a piece of furniture, just like Arthur's green chair. It happened exactly 1 year ago, last Christmas Eve. I had caught a brutal strain of bronchitis in early December. The cough rattled my ribcage in the middle of the night, a dry, violent hacking that left me gasping for oxygen. I had been trapped in my tiny twin bed for 3 days, burning up with a fever, sweating through the cheap sheets. I didn't even have the strength to stand up and pour myself a glass of water. It was the evening of December 23rd. Richard was hosting a holiday mixer for the senior managers at his firm. I could hear the jazz music and the clinking glasses through my bedroom door. My throat felt like it was lined with broken glass. During a particularly violent coughing fit, I sat up on the edge of the mattress, hunching over, desperately trying to force air into my inflamed lungs. The noise must have carried down the hall. My bedroom door cracked open just a few inches. A sliver of harsh yellow light slashed across the dark room and burned my eyes. It was Valerie. She was wearing a stunning navy velvet dress, holding a half-empty glass of Pinot Noir. For a split second, I thought she was bringing me cough syrup. I thought she had a mug of hot tea. I thought at the very least she had come to ask if I was still breathing. I reached a shaking hand out toward her in the dark. Valerie didn't step inside. She stood rigidly in the doorway, blocking the light with her body. "Mum," she hissed. Her tone was tight with urgency. The exact same patronizing tone Richard used when a waiter got his order wrong. "Please, try not to cough so loud, or put a pillow over your face. Richard's boss is in the living room and we can hear you all the way out there. It looks really bad to have someone sick in the house. Richard is incredibly stressed out." I couldn't even answer her because another coughing fit seized my throat. I grabbed my chest, doubling over my own knees. "Thanks, Mum. Try to get some sleep," Valerie said rapidly. And without taking a single step into the room, without handing me the empty water glass on my nightstand, she pulled the door shut. The sound of the latch clicking into place was identical to the sound I made tonight when I walked out. I sat in the dark that night, coughing into a heavy wool blanket to smother the sound, feeling the cold sweat drip down my spine. The fever made me hallucinate a little. I dreamt Arthur was sitting at the foot of my bed, looking at me with a sorrow so deep it could drown a city. When I woke up the next morning, the fever had broken. But something inside my chest had frozen solid forever. I got up, went to the kitchen, cooked the entire Christmas dinner in total silence, and never said a word to Valerie about what she did. I just took that memory and shoved it into the same mental lockbox where I kept Richard's insults, deep in the pit of my stomach. But right now, watching her name light up the screen, I knew the lockbox was full. It couldn't hold a single drop of disrespect more. The phone buzzed one last time and the call dropped. Without waiting for them to dial again, I held down the power button. The screen flashed, asking me to confirm. I hit the button. The cheap plastic gave one final pathetic vibration of defeat, and the screen went dead black. I shoved it deep into the bottom of my leather bag, burying it under the envelope, holding my deed. I looked up. The parish hall was starting to clear out. Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Higgins had gotten up and were shuffling slowly toward the exit, zipping up threadbare coats, wishing a Merry Christmas to Father Thomas, who had just walked in through the side door. The priest was an older man, hair shock white, who moved with a slow, deliberate grace and knew every single soul in the neighborhood by their first name. He walked over to the table where Martha and I were standing. He looked at the empty aluminum roaster, the towering stack of scraped clean plastic plates, and then he looked at me. "They tell me we dined like kings tonight, Helen," Father Thomas said, his deep baritone echoing off the cinder-block walls. "That turkey was so tender Mr. Henderson didn't even have to put his teeth in." "It's a special recipe, Father," I said. "Martha told me you hauled all this down here by yourself." The priest stepped closer. He knew the house was in my name. He knew about Arthur's death. And he had definitely noticed when I stopped coming to Sunday service, because Richard demanded his Sunday brunch plated and served at exactly 9 a.m. The old priest rested a heavy hand on my shoulder, then slowly pulled it away. "Pride is a very tall building, Helen, but the foundation is made of glass. Your son-in-law built his penthouse on your back. When you step out of the way, he doesn't just fall, he shatters. That's not vengeance, that's just gravity." Outside, the street was pitch black. The frost was creeping up the window panes. Going back to my room, that cramped little cell next to the washing machine, meant walking into a hurricane of Richards. Screaming Valerie's manipulative, weaponized tears, and their absolute demand that I clean up the radioactive fallout they had caused. It meant clocking back in as the maid. "I'm not going back," I said. And the second the words left my mouth, I felt them turn to concrete. It wasn't a wish. It was a fact. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. The house is mine. The bricks belong to me. But the hell they just unleashed inside of it belongs strictly to them. Let them burn in it for a while. "You're coming home with me," Martha said, bumping her shoulder affectionately against mine. "You're going to take a boiling hot shower, I'm going to give you a clean nightgown, and you're going to sleep in a real bed." I walked over to the deep industrial sink in the corner of the hall. I cranked the cold water and started scrubbing my old blue enamel roaster. The freezing water numbed my hands instantly, but the repetitive mechanical friction of the steel wool against the grease anchored me. I washed every container, every spoon, drying them meticulously with paper towels. Martha helped me pack them back into the canvas bags. They weighed absolutely nothing now. It was pushing 10 o'clock when we walked out of the parish. Father Thomas pulled the heavy oak doors shut behind us, locking the deadbolt. Martha and I walked down the sidewalk, heading in the exact opposite direction of my house. The brutal December wind lashed at my face, but I didn't shiver. I walked with my shoulders pulled back, my spine straight, keeping the black leather bag pressed tight against my ribs. Martha's apartment was only 2 blocks away. It was a modest, aging brick walk-up with chipped paint and polished concrete stairs. We climbed to the second floor in comfortable silence. Martha unlocked her door, flicked on a light in a narrow hallway, and guided me into a small guest bedroom that smelled intensely of lavender and bleach. There was a full-sized bed with a hand-crocheted quilt, a light oak dresser, and a small window looking out over the alley. "Bathroom is at the end of the hall," Martha said, handing me a thick towel and a white flannel nightgown. "Take your time. The hot water takes a minute to kick in, but once it does, it'll melt your bones." I walked into the bathroom, a hard, cold spark igniting in my pupils. I cranked the shower handle all the way to the left and let the steam completely fog the mirror. I unzipped the burgundy dress, with agonizing care letting it fall. I kicked off the black shoes that had been strangling my swollen feet. I stepped under the scalding water. The impact of the heat hitting my frozen skin pulled a muffled groan from the back of my throat. The water cascaded down my spine, over my bruised knees, over my aching wrists. I closed my eyes and stood dead still under the spray for 15 minutes, watching the smell of garlic fried onions and early morning sweat circle the drain and vanish forever. When I finally stepped out, I dried off slowly. I slipped into Martha's flannel nightgown. It was a little baggy on me, but it was the softest thing I had worn in years. I walked back into the guest room. Martha had left a steaming mug of chamomile tea on the nightstand and left the bedside lamp glowing. She had already retreated to her own room. I sat on the edge of the bed. The black leather bag was sitting on a wooden chair by the door. I walked over, unbuckled the strap, yanked the zipper open, and reached inside. The dead cell phone was still sitting at the bottom, useless and gagged. My fingers brushed right past it and grabbed the manila envelope. I pulled it out. I sat back on the bed and opened the flap under the warm yellow light of the lamp. I pulled out the thick, heavy stock pages stamped and notarized over 30 years ago. I ran the pad of my index finger over the raised notary seal and over the name printed in bold, undeniable black ink, Helen Ramirez, widow of Arthur Mendoza, sole proprietor. I didn't need a law degree to understand the weapon I was holding. I didn't need a judge to reclaim my territory. The true power wasn't in the paper itself. The power was in the catastrophic reality that Richard, blinded by his own towering ego, had completely forgotten whose earth he was standing on. He actually believed his corporate salary gave him squatter's rights in a castle he didn't own. He believed I was just a ghost, allowed to haunt the kitchen out of his own twisted charity. Tomorrow morning, that hallucination was going to shatter. Tomorrow, they would have to face the daylight, nursing the hangover of a ruined dinner, choking on the fresh ash of public humiliation, staring down the irrefutable proof that they controlled absolutely nothing. I folded the deed perfectly, slid it back into the envelope, shoved it into my leather bag, and shoved the bag straight under my pillow. I crawled under the crisp sheets. They smelled like lavender. The mattress was firm. The room was buried in absolute sacred silence. There were no heavy footsteps pacing the hall, no demands from Valerie, no ambient hum of a house that was draining my blood drop by drop. I clicked off the lamp. In the pitch black, I curled onto my side, wrapping my arms around myself under the heavy quilt. My muscles locked in a state of permanent tension. For a decade, finally began to melt. As sleep pulled me under, a crystal-clear image flashed behind my eyelids. I pictured the sun coming up. I pictured Richard waking up in a trashed house surrounded by dirty glass dishes and dead silence, actually believing that the worst of his punishment was the ruined dinner. He had no idea that the real execution wasn't the food I took. The real execution was the door I was going to open tomorrow when I walked back in to finish what I started. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and for the first time in 5 years, I slept through the night. The beam of sunlight slicing through the gap in the curtains hit me dead in the eyes. I didn't even know what time it was. My body, conditioned for decades to snap awake like a loaded spring in the pitch black of 4 a.m., was submerged in a heavy, glorious lethargy that kept me pinned to the mattress. I twitched my fingers under the quilt. My joints throbbed, a dull, aching receipt for yesterday's titanic labor. But the crushing weight on my chest, that constant suffocating panic that seized my lungs every time I heard Richard's footsteps, was completely gone. I rolled my head toward the nightstand. Martha's little digital alarm clock read 9:15 a.m. 9:15. I hadn't seen the sun rise from a horizontal position in 30 years. I sat up slowly. The flannel nightgown brushed against the blister on my right arm, pulling a sharp hiss through my teeth. The caramel burn was an angry, throbbing red, but I couldn't care less. It was a war wound, the very last scar that Kitchen would ever carve into my flesh. I planted my bare feet on the cool linoleum floor. There was no rush. No one was screaming that their coffee was cold. No one was demanding I iron a collar or hide my ugly pots. The silence in Martha's apartment was a blanket of peace light years away from the tense, venomous quiet of my own house. I stood up, slipped into my black low-heeled shoes and walked to the door. The smell of fresh brewed coffee and buttered toast was drifting down the narrow hall. I walked into the kitchenette. Martha was sitting at the small table wearing wool slacks and a grey sweater, reading yesterday's paper with half-moon reading glasses balanced on the tip of her nose. In front of her were 2 steaming mugs and a plate of pastries. "Good morning, Sleeping Beauty," Martha said, not looking up from the paper, but I could hear the smirk in her voice. "I was about to go in there and check your pulse. You slept like a rock." She lowered the newspaper. Her dark eyes were glittering with a lethal mix of complicity and pure entertainment. She leaned her elbows on the table, leaning in close, dropping her voice like we were plotting a heist. "The neighborhood group chat was blowing up until 2 in the morning, Helen," she murmured, tapping her fingernail against her smartphone sitting next to the toast. "Ernie, the night watchman. He saw the whole thing. He sent me a private message at midnight because he knows we're friends. He said your son-in-law's VIP guests started marching out the front door at exactly 8:45 p.m. They didn't even last a full hour. Ernie said the silver-haired guy, the boss your son-in-law was trying to impress, was speed-walking toward his black SUV like the house was on fire." Martha was talking with her hands now completely animated. "The guy's wife was right behind him, her face completely red, furiously buttoning her coat. Your son-in-law came sprinting out onto the sidewalk in his shirt sleeves, practically begging them to stay, screaming that it was a misunderstanding with the catering company, that they could order delivery from a steakhouse." Martha took a sip of her coffee, her eyes dancing. "Ernie says the silver-haired guy stopped dead in his tracks. Looked your son-in-law up and down and yelled at him right there in the middle of the street. A man who sits me at his table with empty plates and lies to my face about an imaginary banquet is not a man I will ever trust with my firm's money. They got in the SUV, slammed the doors, and left him standing there, freezing on the curb. A laugh bubbled up from my chest. It wasn't a laugh of joy. It was the violent release of a decade of crushing atmospheric pressure. Richard had built his own gallows. I just refused to be the rope holding him up. He had tried to sell a flawless illusion of absolute control, but that illusion required my constant sweat, my perfect invisibility. The second I removed my hands, his house of cards didn't just fall. It crushed him in front of the only people whose opinions he valued. "And your daughter?" Martha asked, her tone softening instantly as she watched my face. "Valerie picked her side a long time ago, Martha," I said, staring into the black depths of my coffee. "She watched me get humiliated last night and she stared at the floor. Today she's going to have to stare at the wreckage." I took a long sip. "I'm going to the house." Martha popped her head out from the kitchen, frowning. "Are you sure, Helen, that man is probably pacing the floors like a rabid dog right now? If you want, I can call my son to go with you." "No," I said, grabbing my coat. "I just want to see with my own two eyes what happens when the invisible maid actually disappears." I walked back through the neighborhood. The Christmas decorations looked sad in the daylight. The dead fireworks were just trash on the asphalt. The whole world was nursing a holiday hangover. Everyone except the people inside house number 42. I walked down the side alley of my property. The service door I had pulled shut last night was exactly as I'd left it. Nobody had bothered to throw the deadbolt. Nobody had even realized which exit the turkey took. I pushed the rusted metal and stepped into the small concrete patio. I opened the back door and walked into the kitchen. The visual impact was staggering, but the smell was worse. My kitchen, my pristine, white-tiled sanctuary, looked like it had been ransacked by a mob. The air reeked of stale liquor, cigarette smoke, and pure desperation. I flipped the fluorescent lights on. The granite center island was a graveyard of half-empty crystal tumblers, dead wine bottles, and sticky, dried puddles of spilled scotch. Sitting dead center on the counter like twin monuments to human stupidity were the massive glass casserole dishes Richard had forced me to use. They were filthy, smeared with congealed turkey fat and sticky cranberry juice, but completely, utterly empty. The floor was covered in breadcrumbs. Someone, likely Richard, in a blind panic, had tried to rip the raw dinner rolls out of their plastic bags, but abandoned them halfway. They were sitting on a baking sheet, completely raw, teetering on the edge of the sink. There were cigarette ashes in the butter dish. The trash can was overflowing with crumpled, stained linen napkins. I walked through the wreckage, listening to the soles of my shoes stick slightly to the filthy floor. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the overwhelming maternal urge to grab a sponge and start scrubbing. I felt a cold, deep clinical satisfaction. This was their true baseline. This is what they were capable of when my hands weren't there to magically erase their incompetence before anyone noticed. I stopped in front of the swinging door that led to the hallway. From upstairs, the sound of muffled, violent screaming began to bleed through the ceiling. "I told you to control her, Valerie. I told you to keep her locked in her damn room." It was Richard. His voice was shredded raspy, hovering right on the jagged edge of a nervous breakdown. "She ruined me. Sterling blocked my number this morning. He called me a clown. He said I was a broke, pathetic joke who couldn't even afford a caterer." Something heavy and wooden slammed into the wall of the master bedroom, rattling the drywall above my head. "Eats on my dime," he screamed at me. "And look at us now. The development contract is dead. My partners think I'm filing for bankruptcy because I served them cold bread and cheap wine at an empty table. Call her. Call her right now and tell her to get her ass back here and clean up this pigsty before my parents get here at noon." He wanted the invisible machine turned back on because he had absolutely no idea how to operate his own life. I pushed the swinging door open with the flat of my hand and stepped out into the foyer. The dining room was even worse than the kitchen. My mother's white linen tablecloth, the one I had ironed until my back gave out, was stained with huge, blooming purple splashes of red wine. Crystal glasses were shattered on the rug. The heavy oak chairs were shoved out of place. A couple of them knocked completely over. It looked like the site of a stampede. I started walking toward my room at the end of the hall. My low heels clacked sharply against the hardwood. I didn't tiptoe. I didn't try to hide my presence. The sharp clack, clack, clack of my shoes echoed all the way upstairs. The screaming cut off instantly. There was a heavy, suffocating silence followed immediately by the frantic thud of footsteps hammering down the marble stairs. I reached my bedroom door. But before I could even touch the knob, Richard's voice detonated behind me. "Helen." I turned around. His eyes were completely bloodshot, bulging out of his skull from lack of sleep and unfiltered rage. Right behind him, hovering on the bottom step, was Valerie. She was wearing a wrinkled silk robe mascara, running in black rivers down her cheeks, her eyes swollen shut from crying. Richard closed the distance between us in 3 massive strides. He stopped, 3 feet away, invading my space, puffing his chest out in a pathetic, desperate attempt to reclaim the absolute authority he had lost last night. "Where the hell were you?" he spat, jabbing a shaking finger at my face. "Do you have any idea what you did? Do you have any concept of the humiliation you put me through in front of the most important man in this city?" I looked at him with the exact same clinical detachment you'd use to watch a cockroach spinning on its back. "You asked me not to be a nuisance, Richard," I said. My voice was so calm, so terrifyingly level, it seemed to destabilize him even more. "You screamed at me in front of my daughter to disappear. You told me I had done my part and to get out of your sight. In all these years, I have never been so obedient." He clenched his fists at his sides, his knuckles turning white. "You stole the food. My food, I paid for those ingredients. If you weren't capable of serving a cold, glazed ham in your pretentious glass dishes, that sounds like a catastrophic personal failure. Not mine. Clean the living room," he commanded, his voice trembling with desperation. "My parents are coming at 1 o'clock for Christmas lunch and we have nothing. Help us fix this." He was literally begging me to scrub up his own filth, to save face in front of his mummy and daddy. I looked past him, locking eyes with my daughter. I looked at her smeared makeup, her expensive robe, the absolute staggering uselessness of her French manicured hands. "You're a mother, Valerie." I said my words slicing through the freezing air in the hallway like a straight razor. "You have 2 perfectly healthy hands. Go into the kitchen, pull out a frying pan, and cook breakfast for your own children. And if the house is filthy, pick up a broom. You are 35 years old. It's time you learned how a house actually works." "Do not speak to my wife like that," Richard roared, taking another step forward, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me. "You don't give orders here. Look at you. You look like a vagrant in those borrowed clothes. You are going to walk into that kitchen right now. You are going to take out the trash, you are going to reset the dining room, and you are going to cook something for my parents. And if you don't do it, I swear to God, Helen, I will pack up your garbage tomorrow and throw you in a state nursing home. This is my house, and under my roof things are done the way I say they are done." I didn't pull the manila envelope out of my bag. I didn't shove the notary's signature in his face. I didn't need to degrade myself by arguing property law with a man who didn't even know how to sweep up his own mess. His punishment wasn't losing the title to the house. His punishment was having to live in it without me. "Don't worry about packing my things, Richard," I said, turning my back to him and opening my bedroom door. I already did. Richard and Valerie stood paralyzed in the hallway, staring at me with a sickening cocktail of disbelief and escalating panic. A high-pitched wail echoed down the stairs. It was my grandson, Leo. "Mum, I'm hungry." Mia spilled milk all over the rug, the boy screamed from the second floor. Valerie flinched at the noise looking up the stairs, then whipped her head back to me, her eyes wide and pleading. "Where are you going, Mum? You can't just leave us like this. You can't. Go play the victim somewhere else," Richard yelled, his voice cracking. "We don't need you. I can hire 3 maids better than you by tomorrow morning. Maybe you can afford 3 maids, Richard?" I said, keeping my voice dangerously low, making sure every single syllable hammered into the silence of the foyer. "But nobody is going to give you back the contract you lost yesterday. And nobody is going to give you back the respect your guests lost when they looked at you and realized you are nothing but a hollow man standing in front of an empty table. You didn't kick me out of your dinner party. You liberated me from your misery." I grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door. I twisted it, pulled the heavy oak open and stepped out onto the front porch. The freezing Christmas morning wind wrapped around me instantly, whipping my white hair around my face. But the black leather bag pressed against my chest felt like a burning coal, keeping me incredibly warm. I didn't close the door gently. I grabbed the handle and hurled it shut behind me with every ounce of strength I had. The slam was deafening. It rattled the glass in the window panes. As I walked down the stone path toward the sidewalk, I heard the unmistakable sound of something glass shattering against the hardwood floor inside, followed instantly by Richard's frustrated primal scream and Valerie's uncontrollable sobbing. The chaos had just begun. The invisible machine was permanently unplugged, and the crater it left behind was big enough to swallow them whole. They were trapped in the inescapable hell of their own incompetence, with the in-laws arriving in hours to a filthy house. No food, no corporate contract, and no maid. And me. With my aching knees and my borrowed clothes. I walked down the empty street, feeling for the very first time in my entire life absolutely invincible. The walk back to Martha's apartment was one of the most surreal, euphoric journeys of my life. The icy Christmas wind whipped my face and bit at the collar of my borrowed coat, but I didn't shiver once. With every step I took over the cracked pavement of the subdivision, the echo of that slamming door rang in my head, a heavy, brutal, final sound that had violently executed a decade of silence and submission. My low-heeled black shoes, the ones I had polished so meticulously for a party I was never invited to, clicked rhythmically against the asphalt. I wasn't cold. The black leather bag strapped across my chest thumped against my ribs like a second heart. Inside it was my identity, my absolute freedom, and the irrefutable legal proof that the ground Richard stomped on with such arrogance actually belonged to me. The streets were totally dead. The remnants of Christmas Eve fireworks stained the pavement with grey patches of burnt powder. I walked past the neighbours' houses, watching the Christmas tree lights blinking warmly behind frost-rimmed windows, knowing those families were sleeping off a night of genuine joy. I didn't have a family like that. Mine had mutated into a parasite, a theatre of fake wealth, subsidised entirely by my sweat. But as I turned the corner and my house disappeared from view, the last remaining weight fell off my shoulders. I never had to cook for ungrateful mouths again. I never had to shrink myself in my own hallways again. I reached Martha's building and climbed the concrete stairs with an agility I hadn't felt in years. When I pushed the door open, the smell of fresh coffee and buttered toast rushed up to greet me. Martha was in the kitchenette washing her breakfast plate. When she heard the deadbolt click, she wiped her hands on her apron and rushed into the hall, scanning me from head to toe. Her eyes wide like she expected me to be bleeding. "What happened, Helen?" she asked, grabbing me gently by the elbows. "Did that animal put his hands on you?" "You look pale." "He didn't touch me, Martha," I said, feeling a small, involuntary smile stretching the corners of my mouth. "The kitchen is a landfill. The pretentious glass dishes he forced me to use are sitting dead center on the counter covered in grease and completely empty. Richard is losing his mind. He's screaming that he lost the contract of a lifetime because his boss humiliated him in front of his wife. And what about Valerie, a 35-year-old woman sobbing on the stairs because she doesn't know how to turn on the stove to feed her own children? The sheer entitlement of those people knows no bounds. I slammed the door and left them to burn in their own hell. My knees ached. My lower back throbbed. The blister on my arm finally popped, forming a dark scab that Martha treated with burn ointment every night. The cheap cell phone Richard gave me stayed powered down, buried at the bottom of my leather bag. I didn't care how many times they called. I didn't care to hear the threats or the pathetic begging. My total absence was my only response. On December 28th, I finally put my shoes on and walked out into the world. I didn't go to church, and I didn't go to the market. I walked straight to the municipal utility offices. For years, ever since Arthur was alive, every single utility bill for that house was in my name. The electricity, the water, the gas, and even the high-speed fiber optic internet Richard demanded for his vital corporate video calls. They were all auto-drafted from my bank account, paid for by the modest pension Arthur left me. Richard never once offered to pay them, and I, in my desperate, pathetic bid to keep the peace, never demanded he do it. I walked into the power company's office, pulled a paper ticket, and sat in a hard plastic chair. When the clerk called my number, I slid my ID and the account number under the glass. "I need to cancel the auto pay, sweetheart," I told her, my voice rock steady, "and I need to shut off all services at this address immediately. I don't live there anymore. If my presence was a nuisance, then my money and my signature were a nuisance too." From that second on, house number 42 was going to have to survive solely on the wallet of the man who claimed he owned it. The months started to pass with a sweet, healing slowness. I moved in with Martha permanently. We split the rent, and to bring in some extra cash, we started baking together. I wasn't roasting 22-pound turkeys for arrogant corporate vultures anymore. We baked sweetbread, pineapple empanadas, vanilla conchas, and pecan cookies, selling them to the neighborhood and outside St. Jude's after Sunday Mass. Cooking stopped being an act of slavery and morphed back into what it was when Arthur was alive, an act of love and a means of survival. It was mid-April, nearly 4 months after that explosive Christmas Eve, when the fallout finally caught up to us. Martha and I were sitting on a stone bench in the church courtyard, arranging our baskets of fresh bread under white cloth napkins, when Ernie the night watchman strolled up. He was a thin, wiry, older man who spent his nights walking the neighborhood blocks with a flashlight and a thermos of coffee. Ernie took off his faded baseball cap and sat on the edge of the stone planter across from us. I handed him a warm pineapple empanada. He took it with rough hands, took a massive bite, and chewed slowly before speaking. "Oh, Miss Helen, you wouldn't believe the disaster your house has become." Ernie started wiping crumbs from his grey moustache. "Since you left, that property looks abandoned. The front lawn is completely dead, yellow and crispy. Nobody waters it. The trash bags are piled up on the curb because Mr. Richard got into a screaming match with the sanitation guys, called them a bunch of broke losers, and refused to tip them for the holidays. So now the trucks just blow right past the house. The stray dogs rip the bags open at night, and the whole alley smells like a dumpster. But that ain't even the worst of it." Ernie continued, leaning in close, dropping his voice into that conspiratorial neighborhood gossip whisper. "Early February, the power company cut the juice. I saw the whole thing. The yellow truck pulled up, and they pulled the meter. Mr. Richard came sprinting out in his boxers, screaming at the lineman. But they just told him the account was 3 months past due. They sat in the dark for 4 days, burning candles, until your daughter Valerie had to go down to the pawn shop and hawk some of her jewelry just to pay the reconnection fee and open a new account in her name." Ernie took another bite. "That Mr. Sterling. The boss who stormed out on Christmas, he made sure to slam every door in town shut. Badmouthed him to every partner at the firm. They fired Richard in mid-January. Now he's driving a beat-up compact car, trying to peddle insurance on commission. The bank repossessed your daughter's luxury SUV because they stopped making payments. They just sit in that house all day and scream at each other. You can hear them from the street, blaming each other for everything. I gave Ernie 2 extra empanadas on the house. He tipped his hat and wandered off into the crowd, gathering for the 6 o'clock mass. The final test came in late August on a suffocatingly hot afternoon, when the sky was bruised purple, threatening a violent summer thunderstorm. I was in the small parish hall, wiping down empty aluminum baking sheets, when I heard the distinct sound of heels dragging across the tile floor. I looked up. It was Valerie. I froze, holding the aluminum tray against my chest. My daughter stopped in the doorway. It took my brain a few seconds to process the absolute physical degradation of the woman standing in front of me. She wasn't wearing silk dresses or designer stilettos anymore. She was wearing faded cheap jeans and a wrinkled cotton blouse. Her hair, which used to be flawlessly dyed and straightened, showed 3 inches of dark roots and was pulled back in a greasy, careless ponytail. Her hands, gripping the strap of a cheap knockoff purse, had short unpainted nails, the edges chewed raw from anxiety. She looked 10 years older. "Hi, Mom," Valerie whispered. Her voice was brittle, like glass about to shatter. "Hello, Valerie," I replied. I didn't move an inch. I didn't drop the tray. I didn't run to embrace her. The woman standing in front of me had let a man humiliate me in my own home, and the lethal damage of her silence couldn't be erased by a sad face. Valerie took 2 tentative steps into the hall. She looked around, breathing in the heavy scent of burnt sugar and cinnamon. The exact same smell I used to leave in her kitchen every morning before I was banished. "I've been looking everywhere for you," she said, swallowing hard. "I went to Martha's apartment a dozen times, but she either said you weren't there, or she just slammed the door in my face. I need to talk to you, Mum. Please." Richard hasn't had a steady job in months. The commission he makes from selling insurance barely covers groceries. We had to pull the kids out of private school and put them in the public district. The house is literally falling apart. The water heater blew out, and we don't have the cash to fix it. We've been taking ice-cold bucket showers for weeks. We're 2 months behind on property taxes, and the credit cards are drowning us. I let her empty her bag of tragedies, listening to every excruciating detail of the ruin they had built with their own 2 hands. She stared at me with those huge, watery eyes, waiting for the maternal instinct to kick in. Waiting for me to drop everything and run to her rescue with an open wallet, just like I had done 1,000 times before. "We need your signature, Mom," she finally blurted out, arriving at the actual motive for her visit. She took another step, extending a shaking hand toward me. "We need you to sign a power of attorney or transfer the deed into Richard's name. If the house is in our name, we can take out a second mortgage or sell it to pay off the debt and start a new business. I promise we'll give you a cut. I promise everything will be different." Richard learned his lesson. "He's so sorry. Please, Mom. Don't leave us homeless. Do it for your grandkids." I stared at her extended hand. It was the exact same hand that didn't move a single inch to defend me when her husband shoved me into the dark hallway. It was the hand of the woman who told me to put a pillow over my face so my sick, hacking cough wouldn't bother her VIP guests. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of coming here to demand the deed to the house Arthur and I built just to pay off the debts of her husband's towering ego felt like a sick joke. No, it was one word, short, dry, and absolute. It dropped onto the floor of the parish hall with the weight of a granite tombstone. Valerie blinked, utterly disoriented, slowly pulling her hand back. "No, Mom. I am telling you we are going to lose everything. I am begging you." "You have nothing to lose, Valerie, because it never belonged to you," I said coldly. "Richard thought that if he screamed loud enough he became the owner, and you believed him. But the papers are still sitting in my purse. I am not signing anything. I am not handing over your father's legacy to bail out a man who treated me like stray garbage. You want to see us on the street? You want your grandkids sleeping under a bridge? At the end of the month, I am putting my house on the market. I told her, my voice unwavering. With the money, I am buying a small place for myself. The rest of it is going into a locked trust for Leo and Mia's college tuition when they come of age. My grandchildren will never lack for anything. But the two of you, I am not giving you a single red cent. She stared at me, her mouth slightly open. I could see the exact moment it clicked in her brain. The submissive mother, the invisible maid who magically fixed every disaster in silence, had died on that kitchen floor on Christmas Eve. The woman standing in front of her was never backing down. Valerie's shoulders collapsed. Her face contorted into an ugly, defeated sob. She turned around and shuffled out of the parish hall, dragging her feet, looking exactly the way I did when they exiled me from my own kitchen. And I kept my word. 3 weeks later, a discount moving truck backed into the driveway and hauled away Richard's minimalist furniture, the flat-screen TVs, and whatever designer clothes they hadn't pawned. Ernie told me they moved out at 3 a.m, heads down, throwing bags into the trunk in the dead of night, so the neighbours wouldn't see them. They left the keys under the front welcome mat. I hired a real estate agent. Martha and I went in and scrubbed the house top to bottom. I hired someone to sand out the red wine stains in the dining room, laid down fresh sod in the front yard, and sold the property 2 months later to a massive family with 3 loud dogs who filled the backyard with chaos and life. It's been almost 3 years since that Christmas. The jump in time healed the physical wounds and drained the chronic exhaustion from my bones. With the cash from the sale, I didn't buy a dark, depressing condo, and I certainly didn't rent a back room in someone else's house. I bought a beautiful single-story cottage in a quiet neighborhood on the south side of the city. It's a modest house, but it has massive windows that let the sunlight flood in from dawn till dusk. It has a sprawling backyard where I planted rose bushes and terracotta pots full of fresh mint. Martha moved in with me. We became business partners and roommates. We gutted the massive living room and turned it into our own commercial bakery. Now we bake custom orders for local coffee shops and neighborhood events. We work at our own pace. No screaming, no rushing, no arrogant men demanding we hide our tools. My new kitchen is my actual castle. The subway tiles are a pale sea glass blue that catches the morning light beautifully. There are no heavy, pretentious glass casserole dishes. No freezing granite islands. Just warm pine prep tables, flowered rolling pins, and floating shelves lined with jars of spices I dry in the sun myself. My knees hardly ever ache anymore, because the second my body asks for a break, I sit down. And I don't feel a single ounce of guilt. It's a Tuesday afternoon. The air outside is crisp, carrying the first sharp bite of approaching winter. I'm standing at my stove, slowly stirring the contents of a pot. It's not just any pot. It's the battered blue speckled enamel roaster. The exact same one I used to smuggle the turkey out of hell that night. The one Richard looked at and called poverty. Inside it right now, boiling liquid caramel for a fresh batch of custard pies is bubbling with a thick, heavy rhythm, releasing a cloud of steam that smells heavily of vanilla and toasted sugar. My hands move with practiced ease, entirely pain-free. The white burn scar on my right forearm is barely visible now, blending seamlessly into the natural wrinkles of a life well lived. I click the burner off. I grab the heavy enamel pot by the handles and slide it onto a wooden trivet with a smooth, effortless motion. I wipe my hands on my white apron. It is immaculate. Not a single drop of someone else's grease on it. I walk into the brightest corner of my living room, right next to the massive bay window looking out over the garden. Sitting there, bathed in the rich golden light of the setting sun, is an olive-green recliner. It's not Arthur's original chair. That one rotted in a landfill years ago. But it's an exact replica, I hunted down through 10 different antique stores until I found it. I sit down slowly. The plush cushions surrender to my weight, wrapping around my tired spine with absolute unapologetic comfort. I kick the footrest up, stretch my legs out, and close my eyes. I listen to the silence. There are no frantic phone calls vibrating in the dark. There are no heavy, angry footsteps hammering down the stairs. There are no entitled voices demanding perfection. All I can hear is the sharp chirp of a cardinal in the rose bushes and the distant soft popping of the caramel cooling in my kitchen. I smile in the fading light. I take a deep, lung-expanding breath, and finally I rest in my own home. Please note that the story created and shared today is strictly for educational purposes. This commentary serves as a personal reflection and is provided with a full disclaimer of liability. It is not intended as professional, legal, or psychological advice, and listeners assume full responsibility for how they apply these insights to their own lives. Listening to Helen's journey deeply moves the soul because it mirrors the quiet sacrifices made in the shadows of so many homes. We often confuse unconditional love with infinite tolerance, believing that enduring disrespect is the price we must pay to keep our families intact. Yet this narrative brilliantly shatters that illusion, teaching us that true family harmony cannot be built upon the invisible suffering of its elders. Helen's breaking point was not born of malice, but of a profound, delayed awakening to her own inherent worth. It reminds us that setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary declaration of self-respect. When we allow others to treat us like utility objects, we silently teach them that our feelings do not matter. True empowerment begins the exact moment we decide to stop shrinking ourselves to fit into spaces where our warmth is repeatedly exploited. Taking back your power, just as Helen did with her heavy canvas bags, requires immense courage and the willingness to let fragile illusions fall apart. Sometimes letting the people who take you for granted face the consequences of their own actions is the most profound lesson you can offer them. You do not owe your peace of mind to anyone who actively destroys it, even if they share your blood. Aging should be a season of golden tranquility, surrounded by the respect and care you have spent a lifetime cultivating. Reclaiming your joy might mean walking away from a crowded, toxic dining table to find solace in a quiet, authentic space. Never forget, that the foundation of any thriving household is mutual appreciation, not the silent, agonizing labor of one taken-for-granted soul. The most beautiful humanistic value we can take from this is the realization that it is never too late to rewrite your own ending. You hold the pen to your life's story, and you absolutely have the right to script a final chapter filled with sunlight, peace, and unbreakable dignity.